hand over to our first speaker, who is JK, talking about EF Core query tags and logging.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
let
Thank
me
you all.
see if I have permissions to share. Yes, I have. Can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up. Okay. All right. Welcome to the DDD Melbourne by night, and I'm happy to be here. It's really cool to be at DDD Melbourne, whether it's a full event or just by night. And today I'm going to talk about EF Core query tags and logging. So I am Jernej Kavka, as you have heard. I'm a senior software architect at SSW. You can follow me on Twitter, GitHub, my blog JK You can also go connect to LinkedIn. I'm by day a .NET Core and EF Core developer. I do this 24/7 pretty much. And then at night, I do also mix up a little bit of cognitive services and ML.NET. In fact, I do have a Blazor client-side application called Cognitive Services, which uses actually Cognitive Studio, which uses cognitive services, and it's everything offline except for cognitive services, of course. Just to show you a little bit, this is you, the audience. I'm right now watching this little robot that represents you. And in these trying times, we have to work on, staying active, and this is my way of staying active. It looks a lot harder than it's quite tough. Anyways, for this talk, what we will need is why do we need logging on the SQL EF Core queries is lack of context that when we are looking at the logs. So for instance, here I have a log from a SQL statement that was happening behind the scenes. And what we can see here is we can see what SQL statement we have. We can see on which, from where it's coming from, the URL. And we can also see the action that was executed. But what we don't see is why this query has been generated in the first place. What was the context of this query? And is this actually a query that we expected? Because you might be surprised how many third-party tools you have that just do things with SQL Server and you don't know about it. So this is where query tags are coming in. So you will need to have EF Core 2.2 or newer. And what it essentially allows you to do is inject text into SQL queries. So for instance, if I add a tag to this select statement, what will happen is if you do a SQL Server profiler, you can see over here, get tweet, it adds a little bit of text. So now you can actually look up your logs and saying, oh, okay, this query is coming from this code. Now, the supported queries in EF Core is generally toList, first of default, as enumerable, the simple ones. It doesn't support insert, updates, and a couple of others. And it also supports executing store procedures and raw SQL. So for instance, over here, you can see an example of a store procedure, and you can tag it with query tags. Now, what happens if the query tag is not available? For instance, you want to insert data, update data, or it's a third party for which you don't have access to the code. Well, you can use the Microsoft Abstract logger and add log context. So this is using the built-in .NET Core logger. You can also use this in .NET framework, theoretically all versions, although practically I think after 4.5. And you can use this to log anything really. And what it does, it extends already existing logs with additional context you add, which for instance, if we look over here, sorry. Forgot to mark it. So we should be able to see, sorry, this is no additional scope. So for instance, here we have a just traditional log for this executed code, insert tweet internal, and you couldn't see that it's actually coming from this method when you look at this code. Now, if we add this, so we have logger.begin scope, and then we say ef query as the key and the value over here, anything that executes here, any logs that are saved are going to have this context. So if I look at the log, you will see that I have ef queries key, and then there's the value. So now I can basically track back which line of code might be related this particular query. So if you have rogue queries that you don't know, okay, from where they're coming from, or you have an unusual big number of queries that look similar, you can actually check whether they're coming from the same place or they're coming from different places, but they're just being called, they're essentially identical. Now I'll do demos since this is meant to be a 10-minute talk. And what I'm going to show you here is a simple demo. I'll need to hide your faces. You can't see them, but I can. So here I'm going to show you a couple of permutations of the logs. I'm going to run it, and this is something that's going to be that is already available on GitHub. When I run this, we're greeted with this page where I'm basically showing you the code and how the log would look like when you have configured Serolog and seek. And when you click this button, it will actually run that query. So if I run this query and I'm going to seek, refresh, you can see 1856. It should be this one. This is what actually was executed on SQL Server. And to make this thing simpler, I'm going to just filter by this type. And the first one will be from now. So we won't have as much logs as before. Extensions. So what we have here is what happens when you insert a query, when you insert some data directly to database, you basically get this query over here, and you couldn't track back. So for instance, when we add the tag, we have this tag. I can run this query just to show you. Continuous, right? You can see here we're getting the tweets tag. And there's a couple of permutations here. I encourage you to try out if you're interested how this works in different scenarios. But I'll move forward to the indirect scope. This one is quite interesting. So over here, you can specify the key, the value, and whatever it's executed in here. As you can see, it could be executing a SQL statement or could be anything. It will have this context. So if I run this query, refresh, you can see over here, we have now the EF queries get tweets, whereas the SQL statement remains unchanged because imagine that this part of code you might not have access to, but you can still add context to it. You don't have to decompile and things like that. Now here, there are a couple of other examples I encourage you to check for inserting store procedures and stuff like that. What I do encourage you, if you want to have consistency, you can actually use both. So for instance, in this case, I have decided to add a external logging via the Microsoft Logger, as well as add tags. And what this happens is you can now, for instance, search by EF queries, but also see the SQL statements inside the SQL profiler. So if I run this, I could decide, for instance, to now search based on EF queries. And I can see that until now, I had only one. If I delete the filter, I can see that today I have tried this at least once. So you can now quickly filter based on the queries you're interested in. Whereas if you only add the tags, it's a little bit more work to make a query where you can find the exact queries you're looking for. This is the 10-minute demo. So why would you want to use query tags or log context? Just to summarize. So query tags, if you can, use it always. It's more precise logging, so you can quickly pinpoint exactly that query that you have in code. It's visible in SQL Server Profiler, which is really, really cool, and it doesn't impact performance. And another thing is, if you're working on EF Core before 3.0, there exists a possibility that one query could split up into multiple queries, or even in ON. And this can allow you to identify those queries, whereas with EF Core 3.0, you actually get an exception if that would happen. Plus, EF Core 3 is covering more cases where all the code is running on your SQL Server and your .NET Server doesn't split up the SQL queries into multiple queries. So log context you want to use if EF query is not available, if you want to batch up multiple queries into a single context, if you don't have access to an implementation you want to log, and you can generally use for anything really. Anything you want to add additional context, this is a great way to add context. And if you want to have log consistency, I recommend you to use both, just so that you can have a better search experience when you're using, say, Seek, which collects all the logs. And just as an interesting fact, what you wouldn't notice over here is I actually done entire demo in SQLite. So yes, you can actually collect SQL statements in EF Core from SQLite if anyone is interested in that. But this would all work in SQL Server as well. And with that, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
I hope I was 10-minute sharp.
You did a great job. We do have a couple minutes for questions. If there's any questions, maybe on the channel or on Slack. Didn't see any yet.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to look up this URL over here, will give you the blog post that I have written about it with a lot more details. And it also will point to the GitHub, where you can also run the examples.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks for sharing all that information. Definitely very useful. I see a whole lot of virtual claps coming in on the, the chat channel.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.